All right, everyone, welcome to the January chapter meeting for the Southern Piedmont Chapter of the North Carolina Native Plant Society. My name is Beth Davis, and I'm the Southern Piedmont Chapter co-chair along with Lisa Tompkins, and we're glad that you've all joined us today. We are grateful to the staff and to Amy Tipton with the UNC Charlotte Botanical Garden for co-hosting with us today. It allows us to broaden our reach, and we always enjoy hosting meetings with the UNC Charlotte Botanical Garden.
Thanks, Beth. It's always a pleasure to work with you, and especially to have Dr. M with us today. I just wanted to mention a few things about the gardens. For those of you that have not been to the gardens, I would like to welcome you to the gardens at any time. Our gardens are open 365 days a year from dawn to dusk, and we have lots of programming, online classes. It's available through our website at gardens.uncc.edu. And I would also like to encourage you to mark your calendars for the spring plant sale, which will be hosted online with live curbside pickup starting at the end of March and through the first couple of weeks of April. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Beth.
So now we welcome Dr. Larry Mellichamp, who's going to talk to us about how to select the best trees for your home landscape. And it's funny, the idea for this meeting came to us from an offhand remark from Larry, which he may say all the time, but he said, pick your trees like you pick your pets. And that just was so intriguing because it's so important to have the right tree in the right place. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. He's going to help us with the giving us tips and pointers on making those kinds of selection. And for those of you who are new to the Native Plant Society, let me just give you a little bit of background information about Dr. Mellichamp. He's the retired director of UNC Charlotte Botanical Gardens. He was a guiding force behind setting up the Certificate of Native Plant Studies there, which continues today. It was started in 2009, and it's a wonderful adult education series for those of us interested in learning more about botany and native plants. And so it's ongoing, even in this time of Zoom and COVID. It's a great opportunity to learn, and you can find recent classes new classes on the website. Dr. Mellichamp was a professor of botany and horticulture at UNC Charlotte and taught there for over 39 years. If you get a chance to visit the gardens, please do. The Mellichamp Native Terrace is an area that shows you and demonstrates how native plants could be used in your home garden in a more formal way. And then the Van Landingham Glen is a wonderful, more natural landscape with native plants. So those are two very wonderful parts of the garden to visit. And Larry, I'm going to turn the meeting over to you now, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Beth and Amy, for introduction. I'm so glad to see all your names of friends on the lineup of attendees. I wish I could speak to each of you personally, but thank you all for being here. And this is about mostly trees today, and you might want to take notes, and we'll cover things as we go along. As we've seen, this program is sponsored by the Native Plant Society and the UNC Charlotte Botanical Gardens. So, are you a tree hugger? Most people like trees. This is the largest of the big leaf magnolias we know about in the region over in Gaston County, and it's pretty big. This is the only long text that I'll have This program is about tree use and selection in the home landscape in the Charlotte region, but it can go out farther than that throughout the state. And we're talking about large forest trees to smaller flowering understory trees, which sometimes may be called large shrubs. So throughout all of this, and I'll remind you several times, be thinking about your own landscape, your own homes, your own backyards, and areas that you deal with as you think about trees. And when you think about trees, I love this picture. When you think about trees, you think about form, location, size, and use. Here you got trees acting as a barrier. Here you got trees, you got evergreen trees like a pine, you've got deciduous maples, you've got nice dogwood here next to the house. And so trees can be used in many different ways or many different forms, and you have a lot to choose from. So do you like a lot of trees around your home, or not so many? Think about your own situation. These houses need a little work, I think. Mm-hmm. To narrow the choices today, the trees that I'm going to talk about are limited to those discussed in my book, which covers pretty much all of the best trees. But there are some that are not in the book. But my book is a good source to go to see a list of those trees that are among the best. So there'll be 3 parts to this program. The first part, kind of an introduction. What is a tree versus a shrub? If you're putting this in the context of your pets, this might be deciding whether you want a cat or a dog or a fish or a lizard. There's a lot of confusion over what's a tree and what's a shrub. Sometimes it doesn't matter. Trees usually have a single larger trunk, and they're usually more than 20 feet tall. And here's a deciduous tree, and here's a conifer tree. A shrub is usually a multi-trunked plant that's less than 20 feet tall, like this redbud. There can be exceptions. So here's a couple of exceptions. Here's a red maple with many trunks, and that happened because the main trunk was cut down and it resprouted to give you a multi-trunked situation, and you might like that better than a single trunk. Over here, this is a witch hazel, which is clearly a shrub, normally a shrub with multiple trunks coming up in a small area. But here's one that has gotten rather gigantic. This one is more than 20 feet tall, and it's got a fairly large trunk. It's still a shrub, it's just a big shrub. We're going to talk a little bit of a few slides here of the value of trees in the landscape to kind of set a mood and get you to think about the different ways you use trees, the larger shade trees and the smaller flowering trees. And often your home comes with trees, either in the yard or in the background. And then people add the smaller trees, but you may want to plant a big tree. It'll just take a long time to grow. So trees give a context to the home as a landscape feature, and this is in conjunction with the other elements of the landscape, which are foundation plants and border shrubs. Even down here, even if you have magnificent mountains in the background, you need a context a little closer to home, and this usually is made up of trees appropriate to the region. Trees cool the environment by evaporation. There's no question about this. Trees give off oxygen. Trees provide shade. Trees make citizens feel better because it's green and soothing. And without trees, this would be a fairly harsh situation. With trees, it's much more livable. Trees provide attractive forms and diversity. Here are trees with leaves on them, big leaf magnolias and other kinds of trees during the growing season. You can't see through them. It gives a nice background. And I love this slide I took years ago of a planting of a lot of the different shapes and forms of trees you can see in the wintertime. You got weeping trees and vase-like trees and round-headed trees and conifers, many different shapes to choose from. And you can find these by looking in books and think about things that you might like. Trees provide good fall color. Some are better than others. This is a sassafras clone. All of these are part of the same plant. They turn beautiful red-orange colors in the fall. I don't know if I'd be able to live somewhere that didn't have good fall color in trees because I grew up that way. Just expect to have fall colors. Trees have different colors based on their own genetics, where they came from, how they interact with nature, and all of that needs to be taken into concern if you're planting something and you really want good fall color. We'll talk about that later. Trees may provide attractive flowers or colorful fruits. Here's a tulip poplar, attractive flowers, our southern magnolia with gigantic flowers, and there are a few other trees, big trees with flowers. Mostly the smaller trees are the flowers we most often see. And then in the fall, fruits, viburnum fruits on small viburnum trees or shrubs, and of course magnolia fruits, many to choose from. One of the great values of trees, we're being told these days, especially by me and by Doug Tallamy, is they help feed baby birds that catch the caterpillars from the trees. Of course, other wildlife use the trees in the wintertime. The birds have already eaten the holly berries in our neighborhood. Squirrels and other wild animals eat acorns and other nuts in the fall. And so trees help support wildlife. If you're particularly into wildlife, then you'll choose those trees that particularly support wildlife. Trees can exhibit interesting bark, such as river birch with its peely bark. Trees can have nice foliage, like the big leaves on the catalpa, or the fuzzy leaves on the underside of a Magnolia grandiflora cultivar DD Blanchard. I highly recommend that cultivar. Fragrance, these flowers produce fragrance. You can have all kind of traits associated with your trees. Oh, trees make good places for tree houses. So I'm expecting somebody to invite me to one of their homes like this. I already know of one up on Roan Mountain. But I haven't been there yet to see a house up in the trees where you could have something a little more like closer to home. Why did that do that? There we go. There's trees in the tree house, tree houses in the trees. You do have to watch out. Remember, trees grow. So if you nail something to a tree, or if you cut a hole for a tree, it's eventually going to fill up that hole. And it's eventually going to pull against the nail. So you got to monitor your tree house over time. Now, not to be negative, but we have to be realistic. What are some disadvantages or some negative aspects of trees in the landscape? You've got to be aware of these in this day and age. Trees can fall on houses. Trees can drop limbs for apparently reasons we don't even know about. What looks like a perfectly healthy tree, just bang, one morning it falls over, maybe in a windstorm, maybe not in a windstorm. Here's a couple of examples of trees that could be in Charlotte, where the whole tree has fallen over. And for years, I've been examining the root systems of fallen trees. And I asked myself, where are the roots? What was holding this tree up? And there's one live root, there's a dead root. And this is a huge, big tree with great top heavy. So what held it up? These have got no big roots. I don't understand that, which makes me a little bit afraid of having a big tree near a house. Why is this the case around here? Well, in our region, trees do not have tap roots. Our clay soil that's rocky doesn't allow for it. And as you go deeper into the clay, the soil is anaerobic, there's no air. So we don't get trees with tap roots here. Maybe down at the coast in the sandy, loamy soil, you could do that. But our trees are more of a spreading roots like this. Here you see it over here, what might be called a flat root system. And they spread out very wide, but they don't go very deep. And so if something happens to some of those roots, there's not much holding it up. Trees can have poor form or rank growth. Here's a wretched little specimen of a southern magnolia. It's probably a little seedling that came up on its own, or somebody may have dug it from the wild. It's probably never going to be very good. And so I wouldn't recommend you keep it. Here's a giant wild type red maple in a neighbor's yard that just grows with uncontrolled abandon. It has these huge limbs that hang over, and they hang over the street. Some have already been cut. This one has shaded out this little dogwood tree. So I would say this has poor form. Yes, it's a tree. And the homeowner might say, meh, I like that tree, but it's not a very good tree. It's just going to get worse as it gets older. What's the solution to trees with poor form? Cultivars. Get named cultivars, and that way you'll know that the tree is going to grow up better than the wild type. For example, here's a wild type red maple, young. You see its branches, it doesn't have good fall color. The branches do not have a particular form. They're just growing out in all directions, compared to a cultivar of red maple called October Glory. It gives you a kind of a globose crown, has reliable good fall color. And here are these same two trees 10 years later. Look how the October Glory has grown into a nice symmetrical tree, and the wild type red maple doesn't have good fall color, doesn't have good form, doesn't have much to recommend it, but it's a tree. And so you got to decide whether you want good, better, or best. The roots of trees can distort driveways and sidewalks. We all know about that. They can get into sewer lines. They can get under your house foundation. They can crack things. The roots can spread on the surface of the lawn where you can't mow. You trip over them. Different trees do different things for different reasons. And you have to watch out for that and do something early on in the life of the tree to take care of that before it reaches this stage. I realize this is more of a street tree, but I mean, don't plant a tree in a place where you've only got 3 feet of soil. I mean, that's just not right. Another disadvantage or an advantage, depending on your point of view, trees shade the lawn and cut down on the lawn grass trying to grow. You may actually want to do away with grass under your big trees and plant something under there. But then you got to deal with, as the tree grows, they suck up all the water from underneath. They have very active root systems, and you'll be watering these plants more under the tree than if the tree weren't there. So it's a kind of a paradox. You need the shade to grow the plants, but the tree, sucks up some of the water the plants would get. And so you have to be vigilant about that.
Can't see the house.
And you'd never be able to grow anything under this oak. Look at these big roots coming out here. They've taken up all the soil. They've sucked up all the water. Of course, it's a shady tree, and so there's no grass much anyway. But I get asked all the time, what can I plant under a tree like this? And the answer is a bench, and then get some folks to come sit on them. Put rocks, statuary, pottery. You're not going to be able to grow anything in this soil under a big tree like that has a dense root system. Some trees drop twigs and leaves and flowers at certain times of the year, and you may or may not can live with that. Here are black walnuts on your deck in the back. This makes the deck unusable for about a month in the fall, unless you wear a hard hat. And the walnuts stain the wood, and just all kinds of problems. You've got crab apples, persimmons, nuts, acorns heaven help you if you plant an Osage orange over your deck. Some years ago, I was at the Missouri Botanical Garden, and their little outdoor cafe that had half a dozen tables on a patio, the shade trees there were Osage orange. And in the fall, these things that are big as grapefruits would come crashing down on you. And, you know, years ago, they should have changed that. Some trees can grow too tall or be out of scale for the home or the lot. Like here's magnificent ball cypress, but that gets way much bigger than your other trees in the same amount of time. Might be too big for your house. A tulip poplar, beautiful as it is, one of our fastest growing trees. It's about our third fastest after river birch and sycamore. Very fast growing, will quickly get much bigger than your house and may not look right in the long run. Southern magnolia, they usually get too big for a small city lot. You can't even see the house, and it's heavy in leaf, produces dense shade. So if you want a southern magnolia, you should plant one of the cultivars, a dwarf one like Little Jim. Over here, much better choice of a southern magnolia. You have the leaves and the flowers, and for a small lot, that would be the best choice. Usually you see big magnolias like this on southern plantations where they have lots of room. Okay, now we pause for questions. Beth? Has anyone chatted any questions?
Well, we did have one question and one suggestion. The question was about, and maybe you'll get to this later, about trees used as an evergreen screen.
I'm not going to talk about that.
And then the other thing was somebody suggested moss as a great thing to plant under your trees that where you're trying.
Yeah, moss, it's still, they're very much on the surface, and so they're going to dry out. I think you're still going to be watering anything under a big tree. Evergreen screens, you know, there's only one evergreen tree, a broadleaf tree, and that's our native American holly. Magnolias are from the deeper south, and they can grow into trees, but they take up so much room. Some of these columnar magnolias like Little Jim could be an evergreen screen. Yes, I agree with that. Some of the arborvitaes, which I'm not going to talk about conifers today, they can certainly be an evergreen screen. I like emerald arborvitae. It only gets 10, 12 feet tall. For a taller screen, you might use the arborvitae called green giant. So there are some possibilities there, no question about it. Just check on your growth rates and your widths before you start taking up so much of your landscape with screens. What was the suggestion?
That was about the moss, but then let's do one more question before we get back to your presentation. One person had a question about cultivars and their relationship with wildlife. Is there any difference?
Shouldn't be any different. The cultivars, in most cases, are just better selections of a wild plant. And so, however, in some cases, the cultivar, like on a maple or an ash, may be selected so they don't have messy fruits. I don't know what wildlife eats maple and ash seeds, not too many. But yeah, you would want to check up on, you know, if you're wanting a certain kind of tree, you should check and see what cultivars are available, and see if they do what you want them to do. And I will mention some cultivars as we go through. So that's a good question.
Do they provide the same food element or insects
Well,
as natives?
Yeah, one question here is, do cultivars provide the same food for pollinators or for baby birds, for caterpillars? Mostly, yes. Mostly. I don't know of any examples of where a cultivar is you know, a really bad thing compared to the wild. Okay, I'm going to move on.
Excellent.
Part 2. So we're going to look at some examples of good trees in bad situations, and then some mediocre trees with bad traits. here again, these are designed to give you ideas of things not to do so that you can do the right thing. And some of these are just downright interesting. Like this just shows you what humans can do to trees to create ornamental situation. They can be pruned like Japanese bonsai, so they look like clouds, or they can be pruned into bushes or limbed up, uh, trained into strange forms, all of which can be interesting. I'm not saying these are not good. I'm just saying be aware of what you're doing. So, unfortunate situations. Think about your actions. These are trees that have been topped, where people thought that their trees were getting too big and widespreading, and so they hire somebody to come cut the ends off of all the limbs. Well, this is super bad for the tree because it makes it regrow new little branches, and those new little branches are weak. And in the meantime, the tree may not be able to make enough food for itself if you do this in the spring. And it definitely ruins the shape of the tree. And so my reaction is, if you don't want that big tree in your yard, cut it down. Don't deform it. I'll leave it at that. If you must trim limbs, then you do a technique called pollarding. P-O-L-L-A-R-D. To pollard means to cut off the limbs every year from the same place on the tree branch, and every year it'll grow out a new set of limbs. You see this done especially in Europe, where they have city trees and they want to keep the trees from getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so they go to the expense every year of cutting all the limbs off back to these little knobs, and they grow out nicely the next year. That's called pollarding. You can do that with crepe myrtles rather than just whacking them back every year. And I see very little of this done here in the South, but you could do it. Watch those power lines when you're planting trees, because Duke Power is going to come along and they're only going to cut the limbs that are affecting their power lines. And so you're going to get an odd sculpture on this spruce or over here on this southern magnolia. And you've seen these as you travel around. You've seen trees with holes cut through the middle of them for power lines, or a V shape or one-sided. Well, here, look at this. This is one of the strangest pictures I ever saw when I first saw it years ago. This is a row of beech trees where their main branches were cut back so they weren't be in the way of the power line, and they're all growing back like weeds. And that's not good for the future of the tree. You're going to have to come in here and trim those out again. So that was a bad thing to do. I don't know which came first, the trees or the power lines, but it sure ruined the trees. Don't forget about beeches while we're talking about beeches. Young beeches hold their leaves in the wintertime, and you may or may not like that. A lot of young trees do, and nobody seems to know the reason for that, but I know. It's to shade the bark of the young tree from winter sun when the bark is frozen. Because as the trees get older and their bark gets thicker, they don't have as many of these winter leaves held. And if they were growing in the shade of other trees, they wouldn't hold as many leaves. So it's for winter sunburn protection. How about that? The sycamore. The sycamore has beautiful bark, white bark as the bark peels off, but it doesn't make a good lawn tree because during droughts, they can't take droughts. They're used to growing by a stream. During droughts, their leaves die, they turn unsightly and they die. Little twigs die and branches die, and the tree becomes very messy. And they can actually die if the drought is prolonged, like we had back in 2007. Lots of dead sycamores around. So watch out for the trait that you like. Is the tree going to be able to perform in the setting that you've chosen? It's sort of like having a St. Bernard dog here in the South who can't take the heat. You know, you might like St. Bernards, but can you keep them cool? The pawpaw, a beautiful small tree growing in the forest, big leaves, nice spring flowers on the small ones that you can see. They will form pawpaw fruits. They have fabulous fall color. So why wouldn't you want to plant a pawpaw? Well, they form colonies or clones. In other words, they spread. So you plant one, and a few years later, they start popping up from their root system, and they take over. So if you have this in your backyard, you might not want that many pawpaws. You might not want to go around and keep them cut off. The best way to deal with trees that form colonies is to plant them in your lawn as a lawn tree, so you can keep the sprouts mowed. I don't know if pawpaw is appropriate for that, but you could try that. Otherwise, they're going to sprout. As does sassafras. Here's that sassafras clone. And of course, here's a mowed area that's keeping it in check. They do have beautiful fall fruits, and the birds love these fruits. The fall color is unsurpassed. There are others just as good, but there's nothing better than a sassafras. Be aware of that. I love this picture. This is a wild clone of sassafras, a wild colony, and that's how they grow. This is all one plant connected by its root system, and there's nothing else in there. Of course, they do have beautiful fall color, and everybody wants a sassafras. They're hard to come by, actually. They're hard to get because they're hard to grow from seed. They grow slowly initially, and I bought 2 this fall from a nursery just to check them out. What they sent me were 2 3-foot stems that had been chopped off of the root system of one of these clones, and stuffed them in a box and sent them to me. But no roots. That doesn't work very well. So here's a good example. This is a perfect female persimmon. This is in my neighborhood. I look at it every day, and I marvel at how perfect it is. It has no shade. It's never had any shade in its whole life. So it's grown up all symmetrical and whatnot. But you know what female persimmons do? They make persimmons. And guess where those persimmons land? Yep, right there on the driveway. And there's supposed to be a picture right here of persimmon fruits. And I don't know why that didn't come through, but imagine the little smaller than golf size orange fruits of persimmon landing all over your driveway there. You could go out and pick them up every day and get enough to make persimmon pudding. That's what I've done. Okay, here's a nice evergreen holly. Beautiful leaves, beautiful berries. So let's put one somewhere. Let's put one somewhere where we don't have to tend to it too much. Let's put it where we can keep it pruned and small. And so there you are. There's the holly underneath the mailboxes. And it's kept nicely pruned there. And so there's a tree in a box, if you will. Don't do that. If you need something out of your mailbox, plant a ground cover. Don't plant a tree too close to the house. For years, I've watched this weeping willow next to a building. It's about 2 feet from the building. It keeps getting bigger. Not only that, there are power lines all up here. So one day it's going to become a problem. Here's a nice weeping yaupon, a couple feet from the house. I got to admit, I have one 2 feet from our house, and it has grown up and covered the house, but it's not the right thing to do. Fortunately, it doesn't get to be a giant tree. But these trees that you might plant, or the squirrel might plant, this is a pecan tree, probably a squirrel plant. Look at there, it's bumping against the house right there. So as these trees grow up, they become a problem as time goes on. So you need to watch out for them. So what should you do? The solution, you either cut them down or rip them out before they grow up while they're young, particularly if they're volunteers, if they were blown in by a seed or brought in by a squirrel. Get rid of them before it gets any later, because they can hurt your foundation. And at this stage of removal, it doesn't cost very much. But if you wait too long, you'll be doing this one day and it's going to cost more. And this is not good firewood. So do it now or do it later, but keep in mind what's going to happen. Plan ahead. So palms, and this could be true of other plants, but let's just use palms as an example. Palms are attractive at the coast. They're indicative of the coastal climate. They give a sense of place to a coastal home, a beach home. But do they have the same effect here in Charlotte? Unless you are a palm specialist and want to grow, and there are people like that, and I'm not detracting from them. They know what they're doing, but you may or may not want to have a couple of palms in your yard here in Charlotte. It goes back to that sense of place. Are you trying to, maybe you're from Florida and you're trying to recreate your childhood. Just be aware of what you're doing there. When in a certain region, plant regional plants. Now, some mediocre trees with bad traits to avoid. Here's a black walnut in the landscape, in the ornament. Let me say at the outset, I should have said this at the outset, I'm talking about trees in a landscape setting, not in the wild. Trees in the wild are totally different. We're not talking about that. We're talking about things that are in your yard for ornamental purposes. And a black walnut probably has no place in a small yard. It's a mediocre tree to start with. It doesn't have any attractive colors or flowers, and the fruits are messy unless you want walnut fruits. Silver maple, probably the biggest culprit. Back here in Charlotte 50 years ago, when new houses were built, they put 2 silver maples in the front yard because they were cheap and fast growing. And silver maples can be a teeny bit ornamental. They don't have great fall color normally. You know, they're fast growing trees. No 2 are exactly alike. They don't grow in any particular form. But I can almost guarantee you here in the South, if you plant a silver maple in 50 years, you're going to be doing this. You're going to be cutting it down because it's not going to live in the heat of the South. Silver maples are northern trees, and they're short-lived in the wild. So be aware of what you got in your yard. Hackberry is no worse tree for an ornamental landscape. Hackberries have beautiful bark. They grow to be fairly big trees. They have these kinds of elm-like leaves. They do have berries in the fall. One of their common names is sugarberry. So birds will eat these berries if they don't have anything else to eat. So they're not totally useless in the wild. But in captivity, no tree is worse for getting aphids up on the young growth. These aphids secrete the honeydew from the tree. And they fall below, and they'll mess up your car, your patio furniture. It'll fall on your shrubs. It'll allow for the growing of black mold, black sooty mold. So don't let a hackberry tree grow. Get rid of it if they're young, and just don't plant one as an ornamental tree. They have no ornamental traits. Sweet gum. This is a tree we love to hate. No native tree has a finer fall color. Some have great fall color. There's nothing quite like the sweet gum. Look at the colors. Red, orange, yellow, purple, green, all at once. They grow into big, handsome trees, but they're not long-lived, and they're rather brittle. So they're mediocre trees, but they do have great color. So what's really wrong with them? The sweet gum balls. So if you want to enjoy sweet gum colors, you should plant them back where they're not going to interfere with your life, because you might not want them out in your lawn where you like to walk barefooted or mow the grass or rake the leaves or play with your pets. So, you know, you're always going to have trouble. This is one of those pets that comes and nips your heel every time he gets near you, or a cat that always greets you by biting you. So watch out for that. American elm, a sad story. The American elm is one of our most graceful and majestic trees. Look at the vase-shaped form of these trees. They're beautiful. And they grew up to make great canopy trees in northern cities where they made cathedral-like effects over the streets. But alas, the Dutch elm disease of the past almost 100 years has caused these trees to die. So there's been a major decline. Now there are some new resistant varieties. You'd need to find out about those. But a big old American elm, if you had this in your backyard, is risky because it could die suddenly within a week from Dutch elm disease. So you don't want to plant an elm. If you have one, you want to keep your eye on it. And if you don't believe me, you can ask this guy. He had spent his life savings to get rid of an elm in his backyard, and this is all he has left. And the best uses of elms, I think, is to go to Brevard, North Carolina, and look for white squirrels. They like to hang out in the elms, and this has to be a Bradford pear, but there's some beautiful of these small trees in Brevard, where it's a little cooler than here in Charlotte. So go there and look for the white squirrels. And here's a pine tree. I always look at this tree. It's just down the street from my house. Here's a beautiful shortleaf pine. Here's an ugly old shortleaf pine. Well, you might say, well, it's sculptured and gnarled, has character. I say it's an eyesore. And I say that the limbs fall in ice storms. It's more of a liability than a value. It could fall anytime. But, it's up to you if you like these sorts of trees. Be aware, observe, keep your eye on things like this in the landscape. Questions?
We've had some really good questions, Larry.
Okay.
So here's one. Somebody wanted to know about the lifespan for dogwood trees, and if it's kind of short, does it work to plant a young dogwood next to an old dogwood to kind of continuously have a dogwood?
Well, that's a good question. You can certainly plant one nearby. I wouldn't. It depends on the aging of the old dogwood. Here in Charlotte, they live about 50 years before they begin to decline due to the heat of the summer. When dogwoods are out in the full sun, they don't like that. Dogwoods are shade loving. And so out in the full sun, they do have lots of flowers and beautiful leaves, but it's like sun tanning a white person. In the long run, it hurts your skin. So dogwoods are relatively short-lived then in that sense, about 50 years. So yes, planting a new one will be good. Cutting the old one down as soon as it starts not looking so good to give the young tree a good chance to grow. I would recommend that. Okay.
So back to the slide you had where the trees and the tap roots and stability and thing like that.
Yes.
Are oaks even in our clay any more
No, oaks
stable?
fall down in fact, they're probably the worst. I've noticed that. I used to think that hickories were more stable, and they probably are, but I see them falling down too. So no tree is safe from this where the roots syndrome. And I don't know if there's anything you can do about it other than give trees plenty of room to grow their root systems, keep them watered in the dry summers. But even out at the UNCC gardens, 10 years ago, we lost our 200-year-old oak, which had all the room in the world. It just blew over. It just fell down. And I went out and looked at it, and it had 2 roots. I don't know what held it up the last 100 years. So there's no way to know when a big tree is going to fall. It has to do with the soil is wet, if the root system has been impacted by sidewalks or cutting or gas lines or driveways, and just how the wind was blowing when it blew it over. It's a funny thing. It's unfortunate. Okay.
And then we'll do one more question before we get back to your talk. Do you have any comments about trees to avoid with some of the emerging viruses that are new to our region?
Well, every day it seems there's something new. We all know about the of course, the Dutch elm disease and chestnut blight. We now just lived through the hemlock adelgid, which up in the mountains has killed almost all the hemlocks. Charlotte's not a good place for hemlocks anyway, but the adelgid is not as bad here. I read now of a beech adelgid. I read of the ash borer. I'm reading now about something else coming along that I was going to remember, but I forgot. Let's see if I wrote it down here. But you got to read about that. That'd be a good thing to ask, the Charlotte tree folks, the city arborists, about what new diseases. I'm not aware of them, but I'm sure there are some. And we've lived through the cankerworm blight in Charlotte, and that's over now. But there's always seems to be something to be watching out for.
Yeah, and mentioning that, I forgot to mention at the beginning, but we do have Laurie Dukes coming next month, who is the city arborist, and talking about care for trees and how to plant them most properly. So we can save up some questions to ask her as well. So really, a good segue there. Thank you.
You might email her ahead of time and say, especially let us know about the latest diseases and problems of trees, which ones are worse and which ones are more benign. That would be a good idea. Anything else?
No, let's continue.
All right. So now we're going to look at some of the best trees to consider. This is just a sampling of some of the best trees out of my book. And you may agree or disagree. We can't talk about all the trees, but these are just some. They're maybe less well known. And of course, obtaining a tree could be difficult if you want a certain species. It may not be commonly available at a nursery. You may have to mail order it. But whatever you have to do, if you've got a favorite tree, seek it out. Sweet bay magnolia can either be a tree or a big shrub, either way. They have fragrant white flowers and colorful fall fruits and are semi-evergreen. So they're definitely worth considering. The southern sugar maple. These are the trees that you would find in the woods around here, as opposed to the northern sugar maple. Do not plant. Do not go to it. There are no northern sugar maples east of the Blue Ridge Parkway to speak of. So don't go dig up little. Don't go west of the Blue Ridge Parkway and dig up little sugar maples and bring them here. They won't be happy. It's too hot. I suppose is the factor. Better to get our local southern sugar maple, which is almost identical to a northern sugar maple. They're more heat tolerant. The problem is there are a lot of sugar maple cultivars on the market, almost all of which are northern sugar maples. Over the past 60 years, a number of those were planted out on the UNCC campus, and I kept my eyes on those over the years. They are now all gone, one by one. The one called Green Mountain, the one called Century, the one called, I can't remember the ultra cultivars. There are a dozen of these planted around campus, and they've all gone now, probably due to increasing heat. So get a southern sugar maple. Even better, if you don't have a large yard, is our native chalk maple. These are trees that are 20, 30 feet tall and fantastic fall color. They are a type of sugar maple. They only grow here in the south, mostly in the Piedmont. There's a few scattered around these yellow counties or where they're rare, but their main range is through the Piedmont of the south, which of course is Charlotte's right here. And so these are usually available at the UNC Charlotte Botanical Gardens plant sale. Otherwise, you probably have to mail order them. I highly recommend them as a relatively small tree with fantastic fall color. And then there's our native red maple, which are abundant. Red maples grow from Maine to Florida, and they have different ecotypes in the different regions. Around here, red maples grow abundantly, but if you get a wild one, it's going to grow, as we talked about, erratically. So always better to get a cultivar, and there are half a dozen cultivars available nowadays. A good one is called Autumn Flame, or a Red Sunset is often seen here in Charlotte. They have rather conical crowns with great fall color. And you see how the cultivar of the red maple is doing so much better than the river birch, which has already dropped all of its leaves from the drought, or the silver maple over here that has a puny fall color and not long lived. Your red maple would be a good investment if you get a cultivar. And I mentioned October Glory earlier. Black gum. This is possibly my favorite tree if I had to pick one. And I know of no diseases or pests. It's the one tree that I can't think of anything wrong with it. It has great fall color. It has blueberries that birds just love. I guess if there's anything wrong with it, it's the fact that the berries aren't red. But then you wouldn't be able to see them because the leaves turn red. So black gum is a really good native tree for this region, and it's widely grown. And there's some new cultivars. This one is called Wildfire. It grows fast. The tips of the leaves are reddish when they come out. You'd need a fair amount of room for this because it grows wide, but would be a good choice if that's the sort of, if you have room for it and it's the sort of thing you like. There's also a weeping one. There's a contorted one. And then there are others that I don't even know about yet. So I would look into black gum as a sturdy, disease-free, beautiful, at all seasons tree. The bark is nice. The leaves are glossy in the summertime. It's just something there all the time to look at. American basswood. Not enough people plant basswood. I can only think of two here in Charlotte. They are native here. They're not common. They don't relish our clay soils, but they do pretty good. So they make a nice, handsome specimen. Their leaves are dark green, toothed, and the fruits are these little nutlets that form on winged petioles, and they fall off in the fall and twirl to the ground. And in late spring, they form abundant white flowers that are very fragrant, and you can get basswood honey, and you can use the buds and flowers to make a basswood tea, or a linden. Linden is another name for this, the genus Tilia. You can have basswood. In America, we call them basswood. In Europe, they call them linden. They would be worth seeking out. I'm not aware of any problems with them other than maybe drought, and you're in charge of watering them. By the way, all newly planted trees, you need to water them every week the first summer. You need to check on them and water them every week. If you wanted an oak, a shoe-marred oak, these are readily available. They get big. They have great fall color. And the way you identify a shoe-marred oak is you look under the leaf, and there'll be tufts of hairs where the main veins meet the mid-vein. And that's a true trait for a shoe-marred oak. And here they are growing in a parking lot. What could be worse than that? And they're doing just fine. They can also take it on the wet side because they usually grow in floodplains. So I recommend the shoe-marred oak perhaps over all the other oaks. Red oak is good. They're fast growing, have good fall color. They can take our heat. Maybe my single favorite tree, have I said that before? My favorite single tree is the yellowwood. It has unsurpassed good fall color for a yellow tree. And in spring, late spring, their flowers look like wisteria blooms on the branches. There was a nice one out at the Reedy Creek Nature Center, if you wanted to see one. There's a nice one over at Historic Rosedale Plantation on North Tryon that I planted 10 years ago, and it's just now started to bloom. They take about 10 years before they start blooming. And all around, not enough of these are planted. Here again, we sell these at the UNCC plant sale. So try a yellowwood. Flowering dogwood. Now we're into the kind of big, small trees, small flowering trees. Dogwood is probably the most common ornamental tree in Charlotte. Has, of course, great flowers. You know that the true flowers are these little yellow things. And these are the bracts. They're modified leaves that help attract insects. Mostly are flies. This is a little fly right there. Say hi. Hi, little fly. And good cross-pollination gives you nice red berries that birds love and great fall color that we love. And so it's the perfect small tree. 4 seasons of interest. The bark is nice. Everything is nice about it. We do one common question: we do not have the anthracnose here in the Piedmont that plague dogwoods up in the high mountains. That anthracnose likes cool, if not cold, wet weather, and it's certainly been devastating up in the mountains, but not here. Two-winged silver bell. Everybody knows our mountain silver bell, which grow into big, tall forest trees, but the two-winged silver bell, Halesea diptera, that means two, diptera, is a small tree from the deep south, and it barely gets into the Carolinas, so it's heat tolerant. Blooms profusely in the spring, lasts about a month, maybe a little less. We have one out at UNCC out on the terrace garden. It's been there for 25 years, and it just blooms heavily every year and gets better every year. So highly a good yellow fall color. I highly recommend the two-winged silver bell. May be hard to come by. You'd have to mail order one. Big leaf magnolia. You've heard me speak of these before. They're so unique to the counties just west of the Catawba River: York, Gaston, Lincoln, Catawba, and Iredell. That's the only counties that are found naturally in the 2 Carolinas. Now they do grow out in the Midwest, from Kentucky down to Mississippi. These have the biggest leaves in the temperate zone, up to 3.5 feet long. The largest flowers is bigger than a dinner plate. Their fall fruits are very attractive, and birds love them. Their fall color is not fantastic, but it's nice enough, and they make a handsome tree. They can grow in sun or shade, and might be good for you if you have a big enough yard. Sourwood, one of our unique species, is found only in eastern North America. It has no close relatives anywhere else in the world. This is the fall color and the fruits, and these are the flowers. And this is where sourwood honey comes from, because there's a bee, loves the nectar of the sourwood in early summer. And so these make fairly attractive trees. Here in the Piedmont, where they do grow naturally here, trees are susceptible to a fall webworm, and you would disfigure the trees, and so you'd want to watch for that, and not let that occur if you want to keep your tree happy. But I think it would be worth it to have a sourwood. American smoke tree. There are not nearly enough of these planted. These grow into small trees, not giant trees. In the early summer, their flowers are produced on these fluffy plumes, and those can be quite abundant if the tree is grown out in the sun. And in the autumn, they have just a fabulous fall color of dark red, orange, and yellow. So I would consider a smoke tree. But here again, I planted some out at Rosedale a few years ago, and they're coming along nicely. Okay, so now what? So we've gone through some big trees, we've gone through some small trees, giving you lots of ideas, there's plenty more to look at. What are you going to do about all that? Well, I'm going to show you the last section here is an analytical or objective way to help narrow your choices. But you have to know your trees and their traits. You have to look in books to discover those traits. Then you have to rate each tree that you're considering based on its desirable traits, just like you would pick out a dog. 30 years ago, we were thinking about getting a dog. And so we got books out about all the different dogs and their sizes and their traits and their behavior and what they like to do and whether, their level of energy and so forth. And you want to get a tree that fits your personality, just like you would want a dog that fits your. So you can visit gardens and nurseries and private gardens. You can ask people's experiences, like what are the best trees you've seen? Where are good trees in Charlotte? Go to public park, you go to the Mint Museum on Randolph, see the trees there, check out the internet, lots of nice pictures. So I recommend you get one or more of these 4 books. There are lots of books. I find these to be the most helpful for the average person that will tell you about the trees and their traits. So this is Hutchinson's Tree Book. It's out of print, but you can get a copy for just a few dollars. The author is Bob Head, but it's called Hutchinson's Tree Book, and it has a page devoted to each of the major trees for this region. And then a fairly new book, just a couple of years old. I really like this book, Essential Native Trees and Shrubs for Eastern United States. It gives you height, width, fall color, flowers, fruits, cultivars, nice pictures, just about everything you want to know about trees, large trees, small trees, and also shrubs. So take a look at this. This is available right now today over at Park Road Books. I was over there the other day and they have them right on the shelf, or you can buy them through the mail. You can use my and Will's book on native plants, the whole chapter on the best trees. Small thumbnail sketches gives you the basics. And you might want a little more data. You might go back. I continued to like this older book. This was the first native plant book that I used in the South. Sally Wazowski, Gardening with Native Plants of the South. She lists in there chapter by chapter, big trees, small trees, evergreen trees, conifers, with data, height, width, flowers, fruits, that sort of thing. So, by the way, I just learned that Sally Wazowski has passed away. I don't know how long ago, but this book is out with a new printing if you want the latest. They have these at Park Road Books as well. Yeah, visit Park Road Books. Go to Park Road Books. Okay, so here's the big deal. All of this leads up to this. So after you've got your books that you're going to look up data, you're going to make a chart. You're going to make a table or a chart that lists the species that you're considering. And then across the columns, you're going to list traits. And I only listed 10 here, but if you've got a bigger piece of paper, you could list 20. Things like growth rate. And you want to rate them fast, medium, or slow. Rate them, give them a number, 1 to 3. Maybe the width, how wide, medium, or narrow is the tree. 1, 2, or 3. A wide tree would have a lower rating. A narrow tree that would fit in your yard might be better. The drought resistance, low, medium, or high. Fall color, is it poor, medium, or good? The messiness, is it high, medium, or low? Messy. How many things fall on your head when you go stand under your tree? Does it feed the baby birds? In other words, does it harbor caterpillars? You look in Doug Tallamy's book or look on the internet for a list of that. Does it have nice bark? Low, medium, or high appeal? Nice flowers? Poor, medium, or great? Nice fruits? You can make up your own scale if you want to, or other interests, as you'll see. And then you total up all those numbers and you get an index out here and see which trees have the highest ratings. So here's some examples. Oh, before we get to the examples, you also need to consider, it may not go in the table, whether it's for sun or shade, evergreen or deciduous, what its ultimate size is for your yard, any soil concerns, its heat tolerance, its cold hardiness, its longevity, its ease of growth, its availability, and you can think of other traits that you might want to note. This requires knowledge of the plants. So you either need to teach yourself or learn to use the books or ask a knowledgeable person, your city arborist type people, some nurserymen, some botanists, some folks out at UNCC. You can ask me, send me an email, just all kinds of gather data before you start making decisions. So here's some examples of how you use this chart. So I've chose the flowering dogwood, which I think is the gold standard for any woody plant. I gave it a 3 for growth rate because it grows slowly. I gave it a 2 for being middle in width. I gave it a 3 for being high in drought resistance because it lives here in the South. I gave it a 3 for having great fall color. I gave it a 3 for being low in messiness. It doesn't drop a whole lot of twigs and things. It doesn't feed any birds. It's not known as a caterpillar harborer, so it only gets a 1 there. It has a nice bark, has nice flowers, has nice fruits, and then under other, I gave it 3 for its form, for its layered appearance, and that totals up to 27. So that's a pretty high number. You might want to look. The only way you can get more points here is to find something that caterpillars eat the leaves. So here's another one, a redbud, our native redbud. It's fast growing, so I gave it a 1, meaning less desirable to be fast growing because the faster they grow, the bigger they get quicker and the quicker they die. I gave it a 2 for medium width, a 3 for drought resistance. They grow in dry woods. A 2 for fall color, it's nice, not fantastic. A 2 for messiness, they drop their seed pods, that's about it. 2, they are in the middle range of feeding, of having caterpillars for baby birds. So-so bark, nice flowers. The fruits aren't much to look at. You might even give it a 0. Then I gave it a 3 because it's multi-stem, and I like that aspect in the landscape. So that totals up to a 21. You might not like the multi-stem. You might just give it a 1. You might love the fall color and give it a 3. You can do whatever you want to here as long as you're consistent in how you rate each species. So here's Southern Magnolia, for example. I gave it a 2 because it has medium growth rate, a 1 because it's so wide. I don't know of any wider tree, except maybe big oaks. It's got a medium for drought resistant, 0 for fall color because it's evergreen, a 3 for messiness. In fact, I think I'd give it a 4 for messiness. It is always dropping old leaves and seed cones and flowers. And of course, most of those blow into my yard from the neighbor's house. It doesn't feed baby birds because the leaves are evergreen. Caterpillars can't eat them. You hardly see the bark because it's evergreen. It does have nice flowers. You might even give it a 4. It does have nice fruits. You might like that. You might give it a 3 for its fragrance, or you might give it a 1 if you don't like the fragrance. But in my tally, it totaled up to an 18. A red buckeye, slow growth rate, medium width, drought resistant, no fall color, not very messy, doesn't feed the birds, mediocre bark, nice flowers, interesting fruits. It does pollinate, it feeds hummingbirds, so it gets a 19. So you see how this works. Yellowwood, that nice tree, it totals up to a 20. And then I did chalk maple, it totals up to 19. So this is kind of like what the Consumer Reports magazine, how they rate products. They give them various ratings in each of categories, and then they line them up there so you can see them, so you can know how to choose what you're looking at, what traits you're trying to enable. I don't know of any place that this has been published in a book or anywhere. This is my own concoction. This is the way I've been working for years to help people choose the best tree based on what traits they like. So after you've done all that, you can take a rest in your cherry tree. This is a cherry tree that has been trained to form a tree, to form a chair by this man here. He's famous on the internet. So take a rest in your cherry tree. And while you're sitting there, read about wildflowers and perennials to grow with your trees. Check out Paula and Will and my new book, Native Plant Primer. This book does not have a great chapter on trees. Editors didn't want that. they wanted herbaceous plants, but I do mention a few trees. So my bigger book is going to be the one for the trees. I also need to put in a plug for the Treasure Tree Program. These are folks who go out and look for the biggest, the oldest, the most interesting of our native and non-native trees in Charlotte. You might check out their internet site, the Treasure Tree Program. They're part of Trees Charlotte. And I was out with 4 or 5 of us back in December looking at an old home site, and we found what we think is the best California redwood in Charlotte. And so it has never been measured or listed or noted. And so we discovered it for the first time. So there are people out there doing that sort of thing if you want to get involved. So we're nearing the end here. Just want to mention the classes out at UNC Charlotte with gardening and native plants. There's some landscaping classes coming up, some native landscape design classes. There'll be some tree ID classes in the fall. So there's all kinds of classes out there. If you haven't known about them, you can look on UNCC website and see if there's anything you might be interested in. Ooh, carnivorous plants. There are no trees that are carnivorous. So, last questions. Beth.
Yes, thank you. One question that came up was, what is your rule of thumb when you have purchased several trees for a yard, is spacing them out? How do you think through that?
Well, that's a great question. It has to do with, how big they're. That's why you need to know the width. You need to look up what the typical width is, and so you don't crowd them together over time. And this is also when you might look for a cultivar that's not quite as wide. There are narrow and columnar forms of many trees. And so that's what you would do there. And so you would want to look, if you've got a small city lot like I do, a quarter acre, you can't have more than about 1 tree. So you've got to choose carefully. You can have the smaller trees, the smaller flowering trees, but you might not have a big one. So you want to keep them, so that in 20 years, they're not bumping into each other. In 20 years, a typical willow oak is going to be 15 feet. The branches will be 15 feet long. So you need a 30-foot diameter so that it doesn't bump into other trees. That's hard to comprehend when you're out there getting them for the first time. But you've got to do that. You've got to know what the ultimate size is, so that over the next 10, 20 years, you can judge how to space them. And then you look and see what's going to be seen from the street, what you're going to see from your house, how you're going to walk through your yard with these trees. You don't want to overdo it and get one of everything if you have a small yard. And so if you got bigger yard, you can plant more than one. You might plant a little grove or something. But there's just like with putting furniture in your home, you got to space it out so you have a functional space where no one thing takes more space than you want it to be functional. So no real rule of thumb other than you got to know your trees and know how fast they're going to grow and how wide they're going to get.
Well, darn, we can't have one of everything, but
right.
That's a reality. Here's another question. If you have a new home in a new neighborhood where you have a completely sunny, bare backyard, what is your favorite starter tree? Or
I would plant a black gum. I would want a black gum over any other native tree. I mean, they're native right here in this county. They take our clay soils. They can take the sun. They get better with age. If I had room and if the soil weren't red clay, I might consider planting a yellowwood tree or a smoke tree. Both of those don't like acid clay soil. They would want the soil to be a little less acid. So you'd have to check your pH. Neighbors down the street here wanted a tree in their backyard, so I suggested an October Glory red maple. They don't get gigantic. They look good. they're compact, and so that might be a good choice. And so that's the way you would go. I used to do homeowner consulting. People would hire me to come sit in their yard. I've been in people's backyards that were no bigger than a bedroom. They want to know, how many trees can we plant here? And well, bonsai trees on the deck, on the patio table. And so I help them think about, you know, what would look good there? What does each tree do? What season of the year? You might want to space your blooming times out. You know, there's 25 factors to consider. And the more you know, of course, the more you can do that. That's why looking in books or getting some help and making a plan. I'd get a plot of my property to scale, put the house in, borders, and start measuring space to see how many trees you could fit in, along with your shrubs or vegetable garden or swimming pool or whatever all you have, and just see how you might use that space effectively by making a plan and drawing on a piece of paper. Then I'd go see what the nursery might have. You know, you might not, you'll get a bigger plant if you can get one locally grown. You certainly don't want to mail order things from far, far away. It's very important to note. And if you go to a nursery and they just unloaded a big truck of plants from Portland, Oregon, where some of the big nurseries are, don't buy them. You should buy plants only grown within maybe 2 states of here. And if they won't tell you where they came from, don't buy them. They've got to be grown in the South in order to be heat tolerant. So anything grown in Texas, Louisiana, northern Florida, they'd be great. But don't buy things from New Jersey, Washington State, you know, or Oregon or Minnesota. Even out in the Midwest, you're getting into a little bit of trouble because those plants will not have been grown in our hot, humid conditions. So do get your trees. There are plenty of great trees. All these trees I've shown you will grow here in Charlotte. I've grown them all or seen them grown. And so don't get too weird. Okay.
Do you have comments on the size of a tree that is best to, and I know that has to do with budget, but
Oh, well, I wouldn't get one where they need to bring in a crane and lower it into the hole. But you might want something bigger than a 1 gallon. My neighbors just bought something that looked like it was maybe in a 10-gallon pot. They could handle that themselves, you know, digging a hole that big. I tend to go smaller, so maybe something not much bigger than I am that I could handle by myself is a good way to start. And then people have lost more trees that first year by not watering them. So I cannot stress enough, no matter what you plant, whether it's a tree or a petunia, check every week on whether it needs to be watered, because you've got to get it established. After that first year, you'll have to water it a whole lot less. And about a third year, you may not have to water it at all. But you definitely have to check the first year and water every week. So I recommend that you water.
When should you plant?
Well, you like if you went to the UNCC plant sale and bought something in the 1st of April, you could plant it right then. You just monitor it through that summer. Fall is maybe slightly better time because you're going into a less stress. Plant it the 1st of October. It's cooler, usually wetter. You still got to check on watering, but there's less, you're not going into a hot, dry summer. So fall would be better than spring, all else being equal, but you can easily get trees through the summer if you water them, check on them every week. I guarantee you. I planted 200 trees out at Historic Rosedale over the past 6-8 years. And I believe it was 3 years ago, we had a drought, and I was out there every week, standing in the hot sun with a hose, watering 100 trees. I watered them for 1 minute each. So you can calculate how long that took. But I did it and I didn't lose any. And the next year they were twice as big, they had grown, and I didn't have to water them nearly as much. So you just have to, just like your pet, you got to keep water in their bowl. You got to bring them out of the hot sun. You got to check on them. Don't assume that everything is okay. People assume their plants are taking care of themselves, and they're not, particularly when they're newly planted. So that's that. Okay.
We've had questions about cultivars and if they're grafted and if you have trouble with shoots coming off of them and all of that.
That's a great question. Many, but not all, cultivars of trees and shrubs are grafted because they can't be rooted on their own roots. And if that's the case, then you do have to watch for sprouts coming out below where the graft union is. You gotta watch for that. You can't let sprouts come out from your rootstock. You just go out and break them off or prune them off. If you don't do that, those sprouts will grow up and take over and slowly kill the grafted part. But otherwise, that's just the way you get fancy trees is by grafting, and they always cost more. So beware of cheap trees. Don't buy a tree from the grocery store. Watch the trees that you buy at the big box stores if they're cheap. Go to reputable nurseries and talk to the folks there and ask them about that, and make sure you're getting the species you want is correct, the grafted part is correct, that it's healthy, etc. And then you'll be all right. Some trees can be on their own roots. You can actually get Japanese maples nowadays on their own roots. You can get certain natives on their own roots, especially conifers. But the vast majority of, like virtually all dogwoods and redbuds, are grafted. So there's not much way around that. Okay.
So the North Carolina Native Plant Society website has a link there of lots of nurseries across the state that do sell native plants. So we've had a lot of questions about where to get trees, and in addition to botanical garden sales, those are great suggestions.
Yeah, I know that Cure Nursery, C-U-R-E, we get a lot of our trees from Cure. They're over in Pittsboro, North Carolina, 2 hours from here. I believe virtually, if not all of their trees, are grown from seed, and they grow a whole bunch of different things. So you might look at their website. And of course, then on the internet, you would Google the species or cultivar of tree you want and see what mail order sources are available, and see if any of those are in North Carolina. There's several really good nurseries up in the mountains. I try to use nurseries that are, say, below 2,000 feet. You're getting a little risky if you go higher than that, because they're going to be, more of a shock when they come into the hot Piedmont. So I would look for Piedmont nurseries. There are lots of nurseries here in Charlotte. I mean, just because a nursery's in Charlotte, you don't know where their trees came from. It could have come from the Pacific Northwest. So you have to ask them about that. But Woodlanders Nursery down in Aiken, South Carolina, virtually all of their trees are seedlings. Nurseries Caroliniana down in North Augusta, South Carolina, not far from Aiken. They grow grafted and non-grafted. They have they're hot down there. They're hotter than we are. So anything they can grow would be good for here. Cure, I mentioned. Here in I can't think of any local. There are a lot of local nurseries around and about. A lot of them are wholesale nurseries. You can't just waltz in and buy something. But you could check out local. Here on my wall, I've got a list of 15 local nurseries. Turtle Creek in Mooresville, Oakdale, Latham's in Monroe, dearness up in Huntersville, pikes, various locations, Roundtree over on the west side of Charlotte, Southern Styles down on Ray Road, Campbell's over off South Boulevard, King's out on Stallings Road. I like King's a lot. You should go and see what they have. And another trick is to go buy things in the fall that they've had at the nursery all summer. If a tree makes it through a nursery all summer, then it's probably going to be okay. These plants that are brought in from the Pacific Northwest aren't going to make it through the summer. And so it's good to go see what they have in the fall rather than standing there waiting for a truck to unload in the spring, because you don't know where those have come from. So there's some tricks there of checking out nurseries, going back to nurseries regularly and seeing what they have, seeing how they made it through the summer, through the winter, getting your eye on something and maybe flagging it, and deciding whether you want to get it or not. It's sort of like going to the pound to get a pet. You know, you're not going to know exactly the background of that pet, but you can know a little bit. You can know whether something is going to be small, medium, or large. And at a nursery, you can identify the plant. You can get some idea of whether it's pot bound, how well it's grown, if it's put on good growth past couple of years, even though it's been sitting there in a pot. So there are clues you can look for.